Okay, so now we're going to look at who was to blame for the Cold War. And so there was agreements in Yalta on February 1945, and this deteriorated in July 1945 at Potsdam, and I have got a separate video on both Yalta and Potsdam. Now, what happened there at Yalta and in July at Potsdam, the spirit of cooperation basically deteriorated into open disagreement. There was no common enemy. But there was, due to changes in leadership, there was Truman on his anti-communism and things like that. And so different things happened, but essentially the main agreements that came out was that Germany was to be split into 4 zones, but there was arguments over details of the borders. There was agreements to form the Reparation Commission, which deteriorated exact amounts against who got paid and such things. The sphere of influence was created in parts of Soviets. There was the reparations over Soviet zones, industrial equipment for West zones, and there was disagreements over that because Britain and France saw that as too much. And then there was agreements to form Polish government of national unity. This deteriorated because Stalin had the non-communists arrested, and so there was lots of judgments over what happened to Potsdam and Potsdam. Free elections that were agreed to take place in Europe were cut by the communisms through the power of the Red Army, etc. And agreements to have Russia join the war against Japan with the US after Pearl Harbor were ignored as Truman dropped atomic bombs. So Yalta and Potsdam split up Germany into the 4 sections, worked out reparations, set up the positioning for reparations to be formed after World War II. But due to the varying tensions and, of course, Truman's massive anti-communistic pact, essentially, against USSR, there was a lot of disagreements over what would happen, and the sphere of influence was essentially formed. So the first thing we've got to look at is why the USA and USSR alliance began to deteriorate in 1945. So first there's the key thing, which is the ideological differences. There's a massive difference in both politics, lifestyle, and the post-war aims of both the USSR and America. The USSR was a communist country with a dictator. It was a one-party state ran on a program of terror and propaganda with secret police, totalitarian regimes, no civil liberties. Whereas the US was a more democratic, capitalistic, multi-party election freedom state country built up with states. And so there's quite a different view on their actual politics in their own country. And then there's obviously the difference in their post-war aims and what happened. So, for example, the USSR wanted a weak Germany, and they wanted their sphere of influence within the East, which is essentially going to be more communist countries to help them buffer, but was supposedly seen as just an area of countries that would not be resistant to communists. Whereas the US wanted a strong Germany to remain strong, not to replay the events that had previously happened. And they did not wish to have any reparations from Germany, whereas the USSR wished for reparations. And of course, there are underlying historical tensions, with there being hostility in the past, with counter-revolutionary forces trying to destroy the USSR in the 1917 Russian Revolution, and they were backed by USA, and the Polish invasion in 1921 was of course backed. And then, of course, with the USSR signing of the Nazi-Soviet pact, this caused a lot of tension. And so many people thought this was different. And the also issue was with Stalin refusing to join the UN, which is quite a big point because the United Nations was meant to be this sign of everyone joining peace. And the delay of D-Day and opening a second front was also partially a cause for tension between the two. So both the countries kind of deteriorated basically due to their different views of what should happen to both Germany and also what their own political status within the country is. And so that big difference really deteriorated their relationship. And of course, looking back on history, there was lots of things that they weren't too happy about each other. So we know that the USSR had control essentially over their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, but how had they actually gained control is another point. So they triggered it via political vacuum and anarchy, and they wanted to restore law and order. So they essentially they looked into states which had quite a weak political system and basically went in there claiming to be restoring peace, restoring government, and maintaining that sphere of influence that had been agreed upon in places like Yalta and Potsdam. And so the Red Army essentially occupied the majority of Eastern Europe according to the Percentage Agreement, which was allowed during the sphere of influence. And so they couldn't do much against it because it's what had happened. But Stalin actually wanted to occupy more than what was actually agreed upon through the sphere of influence. He wanted to essentially gain land to make up a buffer zone after the millions of lives that were lost. And so by July 1945, the USSR controlled the Baltic states, Finland, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. And in 1945, communists took power in Albania, Bulgaria as an elected coalition, but then they executed the opposition, therefore forming essentially one-party states and East Germany. In 1947, communists fully took over Romania. They abolished the monarchy. In Poland, they arrested opposition and won by an election. Of course, the elections were enforced by the Red Army, and so it's very dodgy. And then in Hungary, they kind of won via the AVH, essentially won by a war of terror, in which they arrested and executed oppositions using secret police churches, etc., and were attacked. So religion was also essentially taken out in Hungary. In 1948, the communist leader Gottwald took power in Czechoslovakia by controlling the radio, the media, army, police, and arresting any opposition. The non-communist minister Masaryk actually committed suicide, so there's quite a lot of tension there. And then in 1949, the GDR was established, which is the German Democratic Republic. And as you'll learn with most communist names, if they have democratic and republic in it, it normally means they're not very democratic or republic. So the USSR gained control over Eastern Europe from 1945 to 1949 via the use of the Red Army, kind of war of terror, and the essential murdering, arresting, or just execution of any opposition, including ones in coalition that they've been voted in for, and then just worm out the system. So how did the USA actually respond to this Soviet idea of expansion, and the Soviet expansion in the Eastern Europe and in the Soviet sphere of influence? So the US gave aid to Greece and Turkey during their civil wars when Britain withdrew in 1947, and this was to prevent the Soviets and communism taking over, because that was seen as a sign of weakness that showed that communism took most power when it was in a situation where the country was essentially on its knees, and it picked them up from the weak by offering them lots of money and stuff. In 1947, 12th of March 1947, the Truman Doctrine was introduced, and the Marshall Plan to essentially kick Soviet out of Europe was invented. It was to prevent breeding ground for totalitarianism by inventing poverty. It was the plan. The Marshall Plan was essentially to aid money to weaker countries in order to prevent communism from taking advantage of them. This was the main part of the Truman Doctrine. So containment was the policy that US then took from them, detailed in the Truman Doctrine. It was a containment that USA accepted Eastern Europe as the communist sphere, but looked to contain any further expansion. So they accepted this sphere of influence of communism, this area of communism, but they were there now prepared to fully stop any other moves made by the communists and Soviets. And they basically stated, Truman basically stated in his very public doctrine, that they're prepared to send money, equipment, and advice to any country under communist threat. So big examples is Greece and Czechoslovakia. And it was initially not approved by Congress, but when communists won the civil war in Czechoslovakia in 1948, martial aid was essentially allowed and released, and it was worth £17 billion on March 1948. And it was offered to all countries, including the USSR, and discussed during the Paris Conference in July 1947. But Stalin forbade communists to go, and he banned communist states from essentially accepting this money. In retaliation, Stalin created the Cominform in October 1947 and Comecon, COMECON, not like Comic-Con, to support Iron Curtain economies. There was a famous speech by Winston Churchill in America called the Iron Curtain speech, which led to an atmosphere of tension and recriminalization and mutual demonetization of many USSR communist capitalistic relations, and so it kind of pushed a lot further the idea that this was now a war. This was two countries separating, two ideologies separating, and the Cold War was essentially a war of ideologies. So that's a key thing to remember. So we're going to look at the aims of the Marshall Plan. The aims of the Marshall Plan was to aid the rebuilding of Europe, to restore economy and curb communism's appeal from the capitalistic countries, and spread the idea of capitalism by showing that they can provide money and supporting the economies without having to get people to rely on essentially Stalin coming in and saying, well, look what communism doing, we're doing this. It was also to essentially form allies within the Western Europe sectors and form a close bond with them to essentially act as, again, a buffer against communism, and to help basically rid communism from Eastern Europe. It's also to expand global markets to prevent another crash and issues of crashes and worldwide slumps, and also to make Europe more dominant by making them dependent on the dollar, and to kind of push US plans and US policies into Europe by basically forcing them to accept the currency, forcing them to rely on the American system, meaning that they themselves had to rely on America, meaning they would not want to go to war with America and so not want to join communism. Now, the Common Form, which was again set up in October 1947, had the aims to spread the revolution, provide assistance to Soviet satellite and communist parties, which means any party that's sympathetic or pushes the ideology of communism. To defend satellites against US influence, so again, cut out Marshall aid, push for a fairer situation, and defend any country that they saw as threatened by the capitalistic views of America. Keep a close eye on satellites and ensure loyalty, which essentially meant that it would make sure that all the countries involved were following the set rules announced by Moscow and the USSR and the Soviets, and that all Eastern European countries must be communist. This group basically secured the security of communism within the Eastern Europe, and aimed to basically force Moscow and Stalin and USSR's rule upon people. The Common Form was the way of Moscow controlling other communist states. And it also meant that those communist states were protected by the USSR and Moscow, but it also meant that they were governed by the USSR and Moscow, and so much of the stuff was pulled in. And things such as Comecon led to the complete control of their economies and industry, making them totally reliant on the USSR, and often led them in bad poverty states. So then, a key event that could be seen as involved in the causing for the Cold War was the blockade of Berlin. So I'll give you a bit of background on it, and then we'll actually discuss the consequences. So Marshall Aid was started in 1948 as a response to Czech communism, and Stalin began to partially block the roadways to Berlin, to the western sector of Berlin, in response to this Marshall Aid plan that he saw as the US, and quite rightly so, as the US trying to take over control or put Eastern Europe and Europe on reliant on him to prevent communism. And so he put in this partial block to kind of stamp his authority on Berlin, say that he was there to rule it. He was trying to force out the allies of West Berlin, make West Berlin dependent on the USSR, really push essentially a capitalistic country that was a sign of Western capitalistic views in the middle of a communist sector as kind of a defiant state, and it was his trying to make them dependent on the USSR. He wanted to destroy Germany, and he wanted to take it over to the USSR. He wanted to destroy the western sections of Germany, West Germany, and he saw Marshall Aid as dollar imperialism, which was a threat to the USA. He saw it as Marshall Aid as trying to push the USA onto the USSR. And he also saw that it was an attempt to stop Germany from recovering, as an attempt to get Germany to recover, whereas he didn't want Germany to recover because then he would see that as a threat to the USSR. And so on the 1st of June 1948, West Germany was a new country. Roosevelt was a new country, and on 20 with FDR creating it, and the three sectors combined. And on 23rd June, it had a new currency, which led to an economic crisis for the USSR because their GDR, their eastern sector, couldn't essentially function because it was sharing economies. And so the Berlin blockade was pretty useless because there was air flights over it, and it kind of led to lots of views over it because it led to a high amount of tension between different sectors and countries. And so it showed that actually Hitler's the taking over, not Hitler, the Stalin's policy on Berlin and on the western sectors of Berlin was insignificant, but it showed it as quite a flawed system. And the Berlin blockade was kind of defeated by the Western powers via air flights over, and it showed the plan to take over it as very weak. So the consequences of the Berlin blockade was that Germany was permanently divided pretty much, the Western sectors and the GDR. So the West Germany and the GDR were essentially completely divided. The Iron Curtain concept was essentially strengthened, that the Soviets had nothing to do with this, and there was an this was one of the first open confrontations within the Cold War. Tensions were getting much worse, and it saw NATO form in 1949 and the Warsaw Pact form in 1955, which was basically the two different sides of the Cold War showing their power, showing their agreement, and so they were two armed camps ready to go. This kicked off the arms race, which began a set of tense tension with no hot war, but was the symbolic of the Cold War period. As you saw new technology being developed, you saw new things being created, you saw the space race, you saw that kind of thing. And when Trizonia in 1946, West Germany, was formed as a whole country, they merged Trizonia, and the new currency, new countries, and the Iron Curtain speech formed, and then the Berlin blockade and martial aid in 1945 to 1949, you saw this tension spurt up, and you saw them racing for battles in small places. Though there was no hot war, you saw all the terms of the space race, the development of new technologies, including atomic bombs and their weapons such as that. And it really turned into a war, not of who could kill the most people, but who could advance the most, who could show themselves the most. And just quickly, I'll just explain this being the Cold War and the Hot War. The term hot war refers to war in which two sides are actively fighting by the use of weapons, etc., and generally lives are lost. Whereas if you have a Cold War, it generally means there is no war of people. It's more a war of ideologies. It's a war without killing, but it's a war of showing off your tech, etc. And that's what the Cold War was. That's why it's called the Cold War. And after a point of this point of where the Berlin blockade was occurring, the consequence of the Berlin blockade, there was a point of de-stalinization. Because when Stalin died, there was a policy started by Khrushchev, the new leader, during the era of peaceful coexistence, they called it, where lots of things were kind of released. So Tito in Yugoslavia was allowed to autonomously ease relations, and then left the Warsaw Pact. So Yugoslavia left the Warsaw Pact. It showed that there wasn't as much control and push on these people, and it closed down the common form as part of his policy of reconciliation with Tito. So there was a lot of previously Tito had a lot of tension with Stalin, it was now kind of dead, and Khrushchev was trying to recover that. And Khrushchev thought Stalin was a bit inhumane in how he treated Tito, and he invited Tito to Moscow and dismissed Molotov, executed the head of secret police, Beria, and set political prisoners free. He also pulled out of Austria and met Western leaders at post-war summits in July 1955 and openly criticised Stalin's purges, terror, tyranny on 20-party Congress, and eased relations with China, reduced arms expenditure, and improved living standards. But the main aim didn't change. Khrushchev, although he was seen as a new revolutionary against what had been seen as Stalin's rather rough and quite political views that were strong, and as he said, tyranny, he still had that same aim of creating that buffer against attack from the West through the Warsaw Pact. He may have redone agreements with Tito in Yugoslavia, but he was still quite thorough in his view that he would have attacks. And so you've got to come to the point of who was more to blame for the Cold War. Because you can blame the USSR for the radical ideology dedicated to the world revolution and justify its perception of a threat. But you could blame the USA for underestimating the US's loss and misperceiving defence's hostility. So you can have a look at both sides because they both judged the situation wrong, and that's why you can blame them both for miscommunication, tension, and the inability to discuss their ideological differences. So in the answer to that, you could both look at both the countries as getting the wrong idea over each other's moves, get the wrong idea over how to react. With the arms war, one reacts one way, the other one reacts just as badly as the other. With the cut forms of NATO, they react with the Warsaw Pact, and one forms a common form, and so on. It goes like that. So you've got to look at how they each were involved.